Hi and welcome to this brand new episode of Horror Talker. If you find these stories thrilling, do subscribe to our channel Horror Talker. And share it with your friends and family. Let's start with some exclusive stories which you won't believe actually happened. It was a dark, rainy night on the long stretch of highway I'd been driving for hours. My rig rumbled steadily along the wet asphalt, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep my view clear. The only company I had was the static-laden chatter on the CB radio, truckers exchanging stories and weather updates. As the hours passed, I began to feel the familiar pangs of hunger in my stomach. I knew it was time to find a place to eat, but this late at night, my options were limited. I glanced at the GPS, and a small blip on the screen caught my attention, a diner a few miles ahead. Big Eddie's Diner was all it said, but I didn't need much more than that. The neon sign that flickered in the distance was a welcome sight. I pulled into the parking lot of Big Eddie's and parked my rig. The place had a classic, retro feel, with chrome accents and vinyl booths. It was a haven for truckers like me, a place where you could get a hot meal and some conversation with fellow travelers. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, my eyes scanning the room for any familiar faces. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few patrons hunched over their plates, lost in their own thoughts. That's when I saw him, a fellow trucker sitting a couple of seats down from me. He had a friendly smile and a weary look in his eyes, like he'd been on the road for just as long as I had. I nodded in his direction, and he returned the gesture. "Long drive tonight?" I asked, trying to strike up a conversation. "Yeah," he replied, his voice gravelly from hours of talking over the CB radio. "Name's Tom. I've been hauling freight all the way from Texas." "Name's Mike," I said, extending a hand across the counter. "I'm headed up to New Jersey myself." We chatted about the road, shared stories of near misses and trucking adventures. Tom seemed like a decent guy, someone who'd seen his fair share of miles and had the stories to prove it. After we finished our meal, I offered to pay the check, but Tom waved me off. "Nah, this one's on me, Mike. Truckers gotta stick together." I thanked him, genuinely appreciative of the gesture, and we parted ways, each heading back to our respective rigs. I climbed into my truck, feeling grateful for the brief encounter and the warm meal in my belly. As I merged back onto the highway, I couldn't help but think about Tom. He was the kind of guy you met on the road, a fellow traveler who made the journey a little less lonely. I hoped our paths would cross again someday. The rain continued to pour down, creating a symphony of drumming on the roof of my cab. The steady rhythm was oddly comforting, a reminder of the road's ever-present challenges. But as I continued to drive through the night, something gnawed at the back of my mind, an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the rain or the long hours on the road. It was a growing sense of unease, a creeping suspicion that something was amiss. I reached for my CB radio and called out to Tom, hoping to strike up another conversation. But there was no response. It was strange, he'd been so talkative back at the diner. I glanced at the GPS to see if I could spot Tom's rig, but there was no sign of it. He couldn't have gone far, we'd only been on the road for a short time after leaving the diner. I decided to keep an eye out for his truck, thinking maybe he'd pulled off at a rest stop or a trucker-friendly motel. Miles passed, but there was still no sign of Tom's rig. I began to grow increasingly concerned. It wasn't like him to suddenly disappear like this. I reached for the CB radio again, my voice tinged with worry. "Tom, this is Mike. You out there, buddy?" Silence. No response. I pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing my truck to its limits as I scanned the road ahead. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. It was then that I saw it, a flicker of light up ahead. It was Tom's rig, parked haphazardly on the side of the road. My heart raced as I pulled up alongside it, my headlights illuminating the scene. Tom's truck was empty, the driver's side door ajar. I climbed out of my cab and approached the rig cautiously, my breath misting in the cold night air. "Tom!" I called out, my voice trembling. "Where are you, buddy?" There was no response. I peered inside the cab, and that's when I saw it, a small puddle of blood on the driver's seat. Fear clenched my heart as I realized that something was seriously wrong. Tom wouldn't have just abandoned his truck like this. I reached for my cell phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Tom had been right there, in the diner, sharing stories and laughter with me. And now he was gone, vanished without a trace. The police arrived shortly after, and I gave them a statement about our encounter at the diner and what I'd found by the side of the road. They assured me they would do everything they could to locate Tom. I sat in my truck, feeling helpless and frightened, as they combed the area for any sign of him. The hours passed like an eternity, and the rain continued to fall, casting a pall of gloom over the night. Finally, one of the officers approached me with a grim expression. "We found something," he said, his voice low and somber. He led me to a patch of woods just off the side of the road. There, hidden among the trees, was a makeshift grave, a shallow hole in the ground covered by a pile of dirt and leaves. My heart sank as I realized what I was looking at. The officer knelt down and began to dig, and with each shovel of earth he unearthed, the truth became clearer. It was Tom. His lifeless body lay in that crude grave, his eyes empty of the warmth and laughter I'd seen at the diner. He'd been brutally murdered, taken from this world in the most horrifying way imaginable. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I stared down at the scene. Tom had been my friend, a fellow traveler on this endless highway, and now he was gone, his life snuffed out in the most senseless of ways. The police launched an investigation, but the details of Tom's murder remained shrouded in mystery. There were no witnesses, no clues as to who could have committed such a heinous act. I cooperated fully with the authorities, providing them with every detail of our encounter at the diner and what had transpired afterward. But it was clear that I was now a prime suspect in Tom's murder. I couldn't blame them for their suspicions. After all, I was the last person to see Tom alive, and his blood had been found in his own truck. The evidence, though circumstantial, pointed in my direction. As the investigation continued, I became increasingly paranoid and afraid. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that the real killer was out there, watching and waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The road, once a source of solace and freedom, had become a never-ending nightmare. Every mile I traveled was a reminder of Tom's brutal death, a grim specter that haunted my every waking moment. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pursued, that the real killer was closing in on me. I had to find answers, had to uncover the truth behind Tom's murder before it was too late. And so, I set out on a relentless quest for justice, determined to clear my name and bring Tom's killer to justice. The road stretched out before me, dark and foreboding, but I would not rest until the truth was revealed, and the nightmare that had engulfed my life was finally put to rest. I've been a long-haul trucker for over a decade, and I've driven on just about every road this country has to offer. From the bustling interstates to the winding backroads, I've seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would encounter on that fateful night on a remote, rarely traveled route in the heart of the Midwest. It was late October, and the leaves had already turned brilliant shades of red and gold. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Kansas City, taking a less traveled route to avoid traffic and make up some time. The road stretched out before me, a narrow two-lane highway that seemed to vanish into the horizon. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world outside my truck turned into a canvas of darkness and shadows. The only light came from the dim glow of my headlights, which cut through the inky blackness of the night. It was the kind of solitude I had come to relish over the years, a chance to clear my mind and embrace the open road. But as the miles passed, a strange and unsettling feeling began to settle over me. It started as a subtle unease, a nagging sensation that something was amiss. I chalked it up to fatigue, the long hours on the road finally catching up to me. I glanced at the digital clock on my dashboard. It read 3:33 a.m. The witching hour, they called it. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned up the volume on my radio, hoping to drown out the uneasy thoughts that swirled in my mind. The low hum of static filled the cab, and I switched to a different station, looking for something to distract me from my growing unease. But as I scanned the radio dial, I realized that there was no music, no voices, nothing but an endless sea of static. I furrowed my brow and tried station after station, but it was all the same, a wall of white noise that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. I leaned forward and adjusted the antenna, thinking that maybe it had come loose. But no matter what I did, the static remained, filling the cab with an eerie and unsettling sound. Frustrated, I turned off the radio altogether and tried to focus on the road ahead. But that's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in my rearview mirror. I glanced back and gasped in surprise. There, in the distance, was the unmistakable outline of another truck, its headlights blazing in the darkness. It was gaining on me fast, and I could see the glow of its headlights growing brighter with each passing second. I squinted at the approaching vehicle, trying to make out its details. But something was wrong. The truck seemed to be floating, its tires not making contact with the road. It was as if it were gliding effortlessly through the night. Fear clenched my heart as I realized that this was no ordinary truck. It was a phantom, a ghostly apparition that defied the laws of physics. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and pushed my truck to its limits, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and the otherworldly vehicle. But no matter how fast I drove, the ghostly truck remained hot on my tail, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I could hear the roar of its engine, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had heard tales from other truckers about haunted highways, where phantom vehicles and ghostly apparitions were said to roam. But I had always dismissed them as nothing more than urban legends, the stuff of campfire stories. Now, here I was, living out a nightmare on a lonely stretch of road in the dead of night. I checked the time again. 3:33 a.m. The witching hour, they said. Was there some significance to that time? Some connection to the supernatural forces that seemed to be closing in on me? Desperation set in as I tried to come up with a plan. I couldn't outrun the ghostly truck, and there were no exits or turnoffs in sight. It was just me and the open road, stretching out endlessly before me. Then, as if in response to my silent plea, I saw a sign up ahead. It read, "Gas station, 1 mile." It was a slim glimmer of hope in the darkness, a chance to escape the relentless pursuit of the phantom truck. I pushed my truck to its limits, the engine roaring in protest as I sped toward the gas station. The ghostly truck remained hot on my tail, its headlights blazing in the darkness. As I approached the gas station, I could see that it was old and run down, its neon sign flickering ominously in the night. I didn't care about the condition of the place, all I wanted was to put some distance between myself and the ghostly truck. I pulled into the gas station and slammed on the brakes, sending my truck skidding to a stop. I leaped out of the cab and ran toward the dimly lit building, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the doors of the gas station, and a bell above the entrance jingled in response. The interior of the place was just as run down as the exterior, with dusty shelves lined with expired snacks and ancient magazines. But I didn't have time to take in the surroundings. I needed to find a place to hide, to wait out whatever supernatural force was pursuing me. I made my way to the back of the store and found a door marked "Employees Only." I pushed it open and stepped into a small break room, its walls lined with lockers and a table with a few chairs. I quickly ducked into one of the lockers and closed the door behind me, leaving it open just a crack so I could see out. I held my breath and listened for any sign of the ghostly truck. Minutes passed, then hours, and there was nothing but silence. Had I lost it? Had I managed to escape the relentless pursuit of the phantom truck? I cautiously peeked out of the locker and scanned the room. There was no sign of the ghostly truck, no sound of its engine or glare of its headlights. I let out a sigh of relief and stepped out of the locker, my legs trembling with exhaustion. Maybe, just maybe, I had managed to outsmart whatever supernatural force was after me. But as I made my way back toward the front of the gas station, a feeling of dread settled over me. The air seemed to grow thick with tension, and I could sense that something was terribly wrong. I pushed open the doors of the gas station and stepped back outside. The ghostly truck was waiting for me, its headlights glaring in the darkness. It had somehow found me, despite my efforts to hide. Fear clenched my heart as I realized that there was no escaping this relentless force. It was as if the very road itself was under its control, a nightmarish realm where the laws of reality no longer applied. I climbed back into my truck and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. There was only one option left: to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the ghostly truck. I pushed my truck to its limits, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. The ghostly truck followed closely behind, its headlights blazing in the darkness. Hours passed, then days, as I continued to drive without rest. The world outside my truck had become a blur, an endless expanse of darkness and shadows. But no matter how fast I drove, the ghostly truck remained hot on my tail, its relentless pursuit never wavering. It was as if it were a part of the very fabric of the road itself, an insatiable force that would never stop. As the days turned into weeks, I could feel myself growing weaker and more exhausted with each passing mile. My eyes burned with fatigue, and my body ached with pain. I knew that I couldn't keep this up much longer. And then, one fateful night, it happened. I was driving down a remote stretch of highway, the ghostly truck still hot on my tail, when I saw a glimmer of hope up ahead. It was a sign, a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Harmonyville." It was a small, forgotten town that I had never heard of before, a place that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere. I didn't care about the town's obscurity, all I cared about was finding a way to escape the relentless pursuit of the ghostly truck. I turned off the highway and drove into the heart of Harmonyville. The streets were empty and silent, the town shrouded in darkness and mystery. But I didn't stop. I kept driving, searching for some way to escape my relentless pursuer. And that's when I saw it, a bridge up ahead, spanning a deep and treacherous gorge. With no other options left, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and raced toward the bridge. The ghostly truck followed closely behind, its headlights glaring in the darkness. I reached the edge of the bridge and didn't hesitate. I slammed on the brakes and brought my truck to a screeching halt, its tires skidding on the asphalt. The ghostly truck, unable to stop in time, plowed into the back of my rig with a deafening crash. I watched in horror as it careened off the bridge and plummeted into the gorge below. The sound of the impact echoed in the darkness, and then there was nothing but silence. The ghostly truck was gone, vanquished into the depths of the gorge. I climbed out of my truck and approached the edge of the bridge, peering down into the darkness below. There was no sign of the ghostly truck, no trace of its existence. I knew that I had finally escaped its relentless pursuit, that I was free from the supernatural force that had haunted me for so long. But as I stood there on that desolate bridge in the dead of night, I couldn't help but wonder. What had caused this nightmarish ordeal? What malevolent force had I encountered on that haunted highway? I may never have the answers, but one thing was certain: I would never forget the terror of that endless pursuit, the relentless chase that had nearly driven me to the brink of madness. And as I drove away from Harmonyville, leaving the mysteries of that forgotten town behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead held many more secrets, many more horrors, waiting to be discovered in the darkness of the night. The hum of the engine and the dull drone of the radio were my only companions as I drove my big rig along the desolate stretch of highway in the dead of night. The darkness outside was unrelenting, broken only by the occasional flicker of distant stars and the twin beams of my headlights slicing through the void. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a monotonous ribbon of asphalt that led to nowhere in particular. I had been on the road for hours, and fatigue weighed heavily on my shoulders. The miles blurred together in a never-ending procession of road signs and flickering taillights. I longed for the next rest stop, a place where I could pull over, grab a cup of coffee, and stretch my legs. As if in response to my silent plea, I spotted a sign up ahead, "Rest stop, 1 mile." Relief washed over me, and I eased my foot off the gas pedal, preparing to exit the highway. The rest stop appeared like a mirage in the night, a cluster of dimly lit buildings surrounded by a sea of darkness. I parked my truck in the nearly empty lot and climbed out, the cool night air a welcome respite from the stuffy confines of my cab. The rest stop was deserted, the silence broken only by the faint chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of passing trucks. I walked toward the small building that housed the restrooms and vending machines, hoping to find a hot cup of coffee to stave off my exhaustion. Just as I reached the entrance, I heard a noise from the darkness beyond the parking lot. It was the sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable. I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, slowly approaching the rest stop. My instincts told me to be cautious, but I couldn't ignore the pitiful sight before me. The figure was that of a man, his clothes ragged and dirty, his hair unkempt and wild. He looked to be in his 40s, with a gaunt face that bore the scars of hard living. He raised a hand in a half-hearted wave as he drew closer, and I couldn't help but notice the hitchhiker's thumb sticking out, the universal sign of someone in need of a ride. I hesitated for a moment, then made a quick decision. I had been in his shoes before, tired and desperate for a lift. I couldn't just leave the guy out here in the middle of nowhere. I nodded to the hitchhiker and gestured toward my truck. "You need a lift?" His face broke into a grateful smile, and he hurried over to the passenger side. As he climbed up into the cab, I couldn't help but notice the strange, distant look in his eyes, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. "Thanks, man," he muttered as he settled into the seat. His voice was raspy and uneven, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "Where you headed?" He seemed to snap out of his reverie and looked at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Just keep driving," he said, his tone more commanding than I had expected. I frowned but decided not to push the issue. Maybe he had been through some rough times and didn't want to talk about it. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of my turn signal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about my passenger, though. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his posture tense and rigid. As we continued down the highway, I noticed him fidgeting in his seat. He seemed to be growing increasingly agitated, his movements becoming more erratic. He kept glancing out the window, as if searching for something in the darkness. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. "You all right there?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. He didn't respond, his eyes locked on something outside. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but the empty road and the shadowy outlines of trees. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to get his attention. "You're starting to freak me out a little. What's going on?" Finally, he turned to me, his eyes wide and filled with a wild, desperate intensity. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "We can't stop. Not here." I frowned, my unease deepening. "What are you talking about? Why can't we stop?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "Because they're out there. In the darkness. Watching. Waiting." I could feel a shiver run down my spine as his words sank in. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the fear in his eyes was all too real. "Who's out there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, but his eyes remained fixed on something outside the window. Suddenly, He lunged for the steering wheel, his fingers gripping it with a strength that seemed impossible for a man of his size. I shouted in surprise and fought to regain control of the truck. The hitchhiker's face contorted with a mix of fear and rage as he struggled against me. We swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road, the tires screeching against the asphalt. With a final, desperate push, I managed to pry his fingers from the wheel, sending him sprawling back into his seat. I quickly pulled the truck to a stop on the shoulder of the highway, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, my anger overcoming my fear. "You almost got us both killed." He didn't respond, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. I could see tears streaming down his face, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and despair. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "But you don't understand. They're out there, and they won't stop. We have to keep moving." I had no idea what to make of his words. It was clear that something was seriously wrong with this guy, but I couldn't just leave him out here in the middle of nowhere. "Look," I said, trying to calm him down. "We can pull over and take a break, okay? Maybe you just need to catch your breath." He nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I pulled the truck back onto the highway and found a spot to park on the shoulder. We sat in silence for a while, the tension in the cab palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for freaking out back there. It's just, I've been on the road for so long, and I can't shake the feeling that something's following me." I didn't know what to say. The fear in his eyes was real, but his words sounded like the ramblings of a madman. "Look," I said, trying to be as gentle as possible. "Maybe you just need some rest. We can stop at the next rest area and get some sleep. I'll even take you wherever you need to go in the morning, okay?" He nodded, and we continued down the highway in silence. The minutes turned into hours, and fatigue once again began to weigh heavily on my shoulders. But every time I glanced over at the hitchhiker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. As we approached the next rest area, I could see the dim glow of the overhead lights in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot and put the truck in park. "Here we are," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Let's get some rest, and we'll figure things out in the morning." But when I turned to look at him, I realized that he was no longer in the cab. My heart sank as I saw the open door and the empty seat where he had been sitting just moments before. Panic set in as I leaped out of the truck and scanned the area around me. The hitchhiker was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I called out his name, but there was no response. The rest area was deserted, and the only sound was the faint chirping of crickets in the distance. I searched the area for any sign of him, but it was as if he had never existed. There were no footprints, no traces of his presence. It was as if he had never been there at all. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but one thing was clear: I needed to get back on the road and put as much distance as possible between myself and that rest area. As I climbed back into the cab of my truck and pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching and waiting in the darkness. And I couldn't help but wonder if I had just narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. Now, before we come back with brand new episodes for you, do subscribe to our channel Horror Talker. And share it with your friends and family. Until next time, stay awake and stay alert, because you never know.